They said you should be grateful. The match was good. His land touched your father's pasture. His oxen were healthy. He'd lost his first wife in childbirth, which meant he knew what to expect from a girl like you. They dressed you in borrowed linen, braided your hair with straw and twine, rubbed crushed herbs under your arms to cover the sweat. You weren't allowed to speak, only nod when the priest asked if you accepted. You did, because you were told to, because your father answered for you before the question reached your ears. Now it's dark. The fire has burned low, and the smell of barley and old wood clings to your skin. You sit on a straw mattress, still, small, your legs together, your back straight, your hands folded the way your mother taught you. He enters the room with steps that creak. He doesn't knock. Why would he? It's his house. And now, by law, by land, by church, it's his body too. He doesn't look cruel, but he doesn't look curious either. He doesn't ask if you're cold, or if you've ever done this before. He doesn't need to. There's a cloth laid out beside the bed, clean, white, waiting, because tomorrow it must be stained, with blood if you're lucky, with bruises if you're not, with something that says this was real, that you were untouched when you entered and transformed when you left. Because in this time, in this world, sex is not about affection. It's not even about pleasure. It's about proof. And no one asks you if you're afraid, if the scrape of wool against your thighs feels more like rope than ribbon, if the weight pressing down on you feels more like a burden than a man. He finishes quickly. It doesn't hurt as much as you expected. It hurts differently. He wipes you with the cloth, folds it without a word, and places it on the table. You lie there, staring at the ceiling. There's a crack in the beam above your head. It looks like a face if you squint, but the eyes are closed. In the morning they'll lift the cloth and smile. Your mother will weep. Your father will shake the man's hand. The midwife will nod. You'll stand between them, silent. Wife, bride, woman. And no one will ask how it felt. No one will ask if you said yes, because you were never expected to. Not really. Because in the Dark Ages, intimacy was not a question. It was a transaction. The price of land, the sealing of a deal, the cost of a name. This is not romance. This is not love. This is survival scripted as ceremony. And you were never asked. You were only given. If stories like this stop you, even for a moment, thank you for being here. Because uncovering the past means confronting it, not as a string of old laws or dusty customs, but as real people who lived through what we now call history. If you'd like to explore more dark truths like this one, feel free to subscribe or share in the comments where you're listening from. Across centuries and borders, curiosity still binds us. It was never meant to be private. The act, the moment, the first night. It was never yours. It belonged to the village, to the family, to the church. And they watched, not with curiosity but with obligation. Because your body wasn't just your own anymore. It was a symbol of alliance, of honour, of ownership. The bedding ceremony was one of the most common rites. After the wedding feast, you were led through the crowd, sometimes carried, sometimes dragged. Your dress was untied by others, your veil lifted by strangers, your legs uncovered as laughter filled the air. Sometimes the guests followed you to the room, sometimes they stayed just outside the door, but they always listened, because what mattered wasn't whether you felt love, it was whether you bled. They wanted to hear the cries, to hear the mattress creak, to hear proof that the transaction had begun. If you stayed silent, they whispered. If he failed to perform, you were blamed. At dawn, the linen was brought out, held high, displayed like a trophy, sometimes even passed through the crowd. A cloth soaked in red, a sign that the bride had been a virgin and the groom a man. If the cloth was clean, it didn't matter that you had smiled, it didn't matter that you had wept, it didn't matter what was said or felt in the dark. No blood meant no honour, No blood meant you might be sent back. No blood meant you might be tried for deceit, or worse, for witchcraft. In parts of Europe, if a bride's virginity was questioned, she could be forced to undergo an examination by a priest, by a midwife, by strangers. They'd inspect the folds of your body for signs of rupture, as if your worth was written in torn skin and ruptured tissue. If they declared you impure, you could be shunned, or punished, or used without protection, because the damage had already been done. Even among nobles, where ceremonies were cleaner, the rules were no kinder. A royal bride might be watched through a curtain. A handmaid required to stand at the bedside, ready to verify the moment the act was done. Kings often paid witnesses to confirm the bedding, not because they doubted the bride, but because they feared losing the political weight of the union. Marriage was not intimacy, it was politics, and the bed was the battlefield. But even outside of weddings, ritual clung to every act. In some villages, young girls were sent to older men for education, told that a woman must be broken to be built, that love grows out of submission. In others, newlywed women were required to sleep with the local lord first, a rite called jus prime noctis, or the rite of the first night. Historians debate whether it was real or exaggerated, but for the women involved, the trauma was not theoretical. The body was never fully yours. There was always someone waiting to claim it, to inspect it, to judge it. And the worst part? They called it sacred. They said it was tradition. They said it was the way things had always been. So you smiled, you walked the path, you lay still. Because fighting back was not rebellion, it was blasphemy. Because in the Dark Ages, consent was not something given, it was something replaced by rituals, by cloth, by blood. The ones who wrote the rules had never felt the fire. They lived in stone cloisters wrapped in wool, devoted to prayer, silence, and God. Yet somehow they knew exactly how you should touch, and when, and why, and who. Because the medieval church wasn't just interested in your soul, it wanted control over your desire. They wrote books, thick volumes filled with warnings and charts and Latin commandments, guides for how to have sex without damning yourself, only in marriage, only for procreation, only in the missionary position, only on certain days, never on Sundays, never during Lent, never during menstruation, never with joy. Pleasure was a threat, not just to holiness, but to hierarchy. Because if people enjoyed sex, outside of rules, outside of marriage, they couldn't be controlled. And so monks, men who had sworn to never touch, began defining what touch should be. They wrote that the woman must always lie beneath, must not move, must not speak, must not enjoy. Because if she enjoyed it, she might want it, and if she wanted it, she might ask for it, and asking in the Dark Ages was dangerous. Confession became surveillance. You were expected to report your thoughts, your dreams, your impulses. If you had a dream about someone not your spouse, you were impure. If you felt your body respond without permission, you were sinful. They said that masturbation would lead to madness, that wet dreams were invitations to demons, that succubi came in the night to tempt men, and that women were more easily seduced because they were made of weaker flesh. Some monks even believed that pleasure was the entry point for evil, that Satan slid between thighs and whispered in gasps. They obsessed over purity to the point of absurdity. In one monastic rulebook, a man was condemned for loving his wife too much. Another was chastised for kissing during intercourse. Too intimate, too emotional, too human. Saints became the gold standard. Saint Agnes, Saint Cecilia, Saint Margaret. Women who died before they could be touched, or who were tortured for refusing, or who praised God with their dying breath as their bodies were broken. Their stories were repeated to little girls as bedtime tales, not warnings, aspirations. Because purity wasn't just about sex, it was about obedience. A pure woman wouldn't speak back. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't cry when forced to lie beneath a man she didn't choose. She would close her eyes, fold her hands, and whisper prayers between thrusts. But even the monks couldn't hold back the tide forever. There were rumours, books that disappeared from scriptoriums, pages torn out, burned, buried, whispers that some of the holiest men had secret lives, that behind locked abbey doors, rules bent, hands wandered, laws blurred, because the body forgets the commandments, but it remembers the heat. And as the monks preached abstinence, villagers dreamed of more, of kisses that meant something, of touches not tied to guilt, of a world where pleasure was not a sin, but a right. But that world didn't exist yet. Not for them, not for her, not for you. Because in the Dark Ages, even God had something to say about what happened in your bed. And the ones who spoke for him made sure you never forgot it. They said a woman's body was sacred, but they forgot to mention, only if it served someone else. The church didn't just dictate who you could lie with, it dictated that you must lie down, even when every part of you wanted to run. Because in marriage, consent was not required. Once the vows were spoken, your body belonged to your husband. Every night, every time, whether you wanted it or not. This wasn't hidden, it wasn't whispered, it was written clearly into law, preached from pulpits, and echoed in confessionals. A wife owes her husband access. Her duty is to be available. Her virtue lies in her silence. You could be beaten for refusing, not just privately, legally. Clergy taught that a man had the right to correct a disobedient wife. And what was more disobedient than withholding what he believed was his? If you said no, you were accused of tempting him into sin, of leading him toward adultery, or worse, of making him vulnerable to demonic temptation. It was your fault, always. Even death didn't protect you. Some widows were accused of withholding their bodies from society. If they didn't remarry quickly, if they chose solitude over submission, they were labelled suspicious, unnatural, possibly witches. And then there was the myth that refused to die. Jus prime noctis, the right of the first night. The idea that lords could sleep with a peasant bride before her husband. Historians argue whether it was law, rumour or propaganda, but the trauma was real, because women were often given as tribute, as leverage, as protection, sometimes to their landlord, sometimes to a visiting noble, sometimes to a priest, and if they resisted, they were labelled impure, ruined, unmarriageable. There are records of women who begged to enter convents, not because they sought God, but because they were trying to escape the reach of men. But even behind convent walls, they weren't safe. Nuns who spoke of abuse were silenced, or punished, or declared possessed. Because if the church is holy, then those who lead it must be too, right? So any sin must come from you, from your mouth, your thighs, your dreams. They made women confess to being seductive for the crime of being seen. They made girls confess to inviting the touch, because they didn't flinch quickly enough. They made silence the highest form of obedience, and suffering the surest path to heaven. Because in the Dark Ages there was no such thing as marital rape. There was only duty. And if it hurt, that was your cross to bear. If it frightened you, that was the devil testing your resolve. If it scarred you, then suffer in silence as the saints did. They told you to close your eyes, bite your lip, and endure. Because a woman's pain wasn't a problem, it was a sacrament. It didn't have to happen for you to be guilty. You didn't need to be touched. You didn't need to say yes. You didn't even need to open your mouth. All it took was a thought, a flicker behind the eyes, a shiver during sleep, a gasp you didn't mean to make, and suddenly you were damned. Because in the Dark Ages, desire itself was evidence of sin. They believed dreams were doors, that when your body relaxed, your soul became vulnerable, that something waited in the night, watching, waiting for you to close your eyes. The succubus. She came in the form of a beautiful woman, smooth skin, whispering voice. She straddled the sleeping man, drained him of energy, left him weak in the morning. But it wasn't his fault, of course. She was a demon, a tempter, a thief. Then there was the incubus, the male spirit. He came to women, especially virgins, widows, or wives whose husbands were far away. He entered their rooms without a sound, pressed into their chests, pinned their arms, and left them breathless. And if a girl awoke sweating, trembling, her thighs damp, it wasn't a dream. It was a visitation. Nocturnal emissions in men were blamed on the devil. For women, unexplained pleasure was considered worse, because it proved that lust lived in the body even when no man was near. A woman who enjoyed sex was suspicious. A woman who dreamed about it was dangerous. They said the devil liked to hide inside the womb, that he travelled through blood and bone, climbed into thoughts, and spread temptation like a fever. Midwives told stories of women who cried out in the night only to wake with claw marks down their legs. Monks wrote of visions where saints were tempted by unseen forces and overcame by biting their own tongues, scratching their skin, bleeding until the desire passed. Desire wasn't just unwelcome, it was a haunting. If you liked it, you were corrupted. If you feared it, you were weak. If you wanted it, you were evil. Even married women were warned. Don't move too much. Don't moan. Don't enjoy it too obviously, because enjoyment meant you had learned it somewhere, and learning it meant someone had taught you, and that someone was never your husband. Women were burned, flogged, or locked away for unnatural appetites. Even whispering about pleasure could earn you a charge of witchcraft. And so you stopped asking, stopped wondering, stopped dreaming. You folded your longing into silence. You hid it in your bones. You trained yourself to go still when touched, to breathe without sound, to keep your face calm while your skin screamed. Because even fantasy could betray you. Even imagination had teeth. And if the wrong word slipped, if someone heard you sigh in your sleep, if a priest noticed the redness in your cheeks, they wouldn't ask what you felt. They'd ask who sent it and what evil now lived beneath your skin. Because in the Dark Ages, sex didn't have to happen to destroy you. Thinking about it was enough. You could sell a chicken, you could sell a goat, you could even sell your own labour if your back didn't give out first. But in the Dark Ages, there was one currency that never lost value. Your body, not your mind, not your hands, not your skill or voice or soul, just skin, breath, open legs and closed mouths. If you were poor, and most were, there were few choices: starve, beg, or offer what men always believed was theirs to take. They didn't call it prostitution in the beginning. They called it arrangement. They called it mercy. A woman who kept company with a wealthy merchant might be fed through winter. A girl who visited the manor on feast days might return with bread, coins, or salt. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. There were brothels, of course, whole streets of them, in towns and cities, sometimes even licensed by local bishops. Yes, by bishops. Because as long as sin stayed in certain quarters, as long as the poor bore the shame, the church could still call itself holy. Monasteries hired prostitutes in secret. Some even kept them on retainer, a necessary evil to protect young monks from greater temptations. But for the women, there were no protections, no rights, no forgiveness. They were whipped if caught walking outside at the wrong hour. They were branded, taxed, fined, expelled from towns when plague swept through, as if their existence invited the disease. And yet, they were still summoned, still used, still expected to smile. Men could sleep with as many as they pleased. No shame, no record, no punishment. But a woman who was suspected of having once enjoyed a man was considered ruined. Widows were fair game, servants even more so. Slaves, because yes, slavery persisted, were considered beyond law. In noble courts, kings kept mistresses openly. They had entire wings of castles reserved for pleasure. And the women there, they weren't always willing. They were chosen. And when they weren't chosen anymore, they were discarded like bad meat. If a nobleman seduced a peasant girl, it was considered a joke. If she resisted, she might be accused of theft, for denying him what he believed was his. Even marriage didn't shield you. Many wives were purchased, not courted, bartered for land, sheep, or a title. They arrived at their new homes like livestock, examined, tasted, bred. Because fertility was another market. A woman who could bear sons was a prized asset. One who couldn't, returned, blamed, sometimes exiled. There are records of barren women sent to live in barns, of girls beaten for giving birth to daughters, of wives loaned out to fertile men under cover of darkness. Because the husband wanted an heir, but not the shame of being the problem, and so the market grew, invisible, insatiable, always hungry. Sex was not about connection, it was about access, and who had it, and who didn't, and how easily it could be bought. Even your virginity had a price, sometimes the highest one. There are stories, too many to count, of girls sold to priests, of boys bought by travelling noblemen, of children handed over by desperate parents who just wanted one less mouth to feed. They were washed, perfumed, dressed in ribbons, and then undone. They didn't always scream, but the silence cost more, because in the Dark Ages bodies were commodities, not temples, not vessels of the soul, not sacred, just soft flesh, ready for the next transaction. He touched your hand once, not like the others, not like a merchant inspecting fruit, not like a priest measuring sin. It was gentle, a moment that didn't ask for anything. No cloth waiting to be stained, no whisper of duty, no transaction behind it, just warmth, a thumb brushing your palm, a glance that didn't search, just saw. And you flinched, not because you feared him, but because something in you wanted to lean closer. And that was more dangerous than anything, because love wasn't made for you, not in the world that raised you, not in the skin you learned to bury. Love was a luxury. It was for the songs they sang at weddings, for the books that only the rich could read, for the noble women who flirted behind fans at court. You weren't taught love. You were taught compliance. You were taught to stay still when hands found you, to cry without sound, to bleed without complaint, to give without return. When he smiled at you, you looked away, because no one had ever looked at you with kindness. They looked at you for confirmation, for performance, for proof, not for you. He brought you bread once, left it on the windowsill, still warm, no note, no demand, just a piece of bread. You stared at it for an hour, then fed it to the chickens, because you couldn't risk believing in softness. Not now, not after years of being opened, inspected, erased. He came back again. He waited at the edge of the well, spoke about the sky, the trees, his mother's hands, nothing that asked you to give, just words. But even that was too much, because you knew what would happen. You'd begin to speak, to feel, to hope, and one day he would touch you in the way they all do. Because that's what men do, even the good ones, and you wouldn't know how to say no, not because you didn't want to, but because your mouth had been trained to stay closed, so you turned away, you stayed silent, and for the first time someone left without taking. You cried after, not for him, but for the girl you might have been, in another time, another place, another story. One where love wasn't something you had to survive. Because in the Dark Ages, love couldn't fix what was already broken. It couldn't stitch closed what had been torn open night after night. It couldn't unteach your body the difference between closeness and fear. It couldn't erase the rituals, the cloths, the bruises dressed as blessings. It couldn't undo a culture that taught you your only worth was in how quietly you suffered. So you stood in the doorway, watched the sun hit his back as he walked away, and let the silence hold you one more night. Because love is not always a rescue. Sometimes it's just a reminder of everything you lost before you ever had the chance to say yes. They'll tell you it was different back then, that people didn't think the way we do, that it wasn't abuse, it was culture, it wasn't cruelty, it was custom, it wasn't pain, it was just the way things were. But that's not the question that lingers. The question isn't did it happen? It isn't even why did no one stop it? The question is simpler, sharper, more haunting. What did she feel when the priest told her to obey, when the cloth was held up for all to see, when she was touched in the dark and told to be grateful, when her thoughts betrayed her, when her silence became her worth? What did she feel when she realized love would not be gentle, when pleasure could not be spoken, when the act itself, sacred, personal, alive, was repackaged as obligation, as payment, as a tool? She didn't write it down. Her name wasn't recorded. She left no letters, no diaries, no confessions that survived the centuries. All we have is what men said about her, what bishops decided for her, what husbands took from her, what monks imagined behind closed doors and blamed on her body. But she lived, she breathed, she hurt, and somewhere deep inside the rituals and the rules, beneath the cloth and behind the veil, there was a girl who wanted to be seen. Not inspected, not judged, not saved, just seen. There are places in the world today where the rules haven't changed that much, where bodies are still controlled, where silence is still rewarded, where pain is still called purity. The robes look different, the language is softer, the punishments are quieter, but the feeling is the same, that somewhere, somehow, you're not yours. And that's the cruelty that echoes, not the violence itself, but the idea that it was ever normal. The girl in the story never got to ask, never got to wonder aloud, never got to rage or resist or reclaim, but we do. So ask the question, what did she feel? And let the answer disturb you. Let it change how you see the past. Let it shape how you hold the present. Because the most bizarre practices of the Dark Ages didn't end in the Dark Ages. Some of them just learned how to smile.